I never imagined that surviving emergency surgery would be the easy part. The moment my neighbor, Tessa Whitmore, texted me, "Garrett, don't call your wife. Just look in your bed before you believe anything they tell you." My stomach dropped harder than it had on the operating table. I stared at that message until the screen went dark. But before I could ask what she meant, she blocked every call and never replied again. Lying in that hospital bed, I kept telling myself there had to be a simple explanation. But deep down, I already knew something inside my home had changed while I was gone. I just didn't know that the person I had spent 31 years trusting, and the man I had reluctantly allowed into my life, had already started a chain of betrayal that would force me to question every memory, every promise, and even whether the house waiting for me was still mine at all. Before I tell you what I found hidden inside my own bed, and why that single discovery changed everything, take a second to subscribe if you enjoy real-life stories about betrayal, family, and justice. Now let me show you exactly how this nightmare began. I woke up in a hospital room with a dull ache running across my chest and the steady beep of a heart monitor reminding me that I was luckier than most people in my situation. My name is Garrett Holloway, and at 63, I thought I had already learned every lesson life wanted to teach me. After spending nearly 4 decades as an industrial safety consultant, I had finally started slowing down, enjoying quiet mornings, fixing little things around the house, and looking forward to a retirement I believed I had earned. My wife, Elise Holloway, and I had been married for 31 years. We weren't one of those couples who posted perfect pictures or pretended life was flawless. We'd argued, struggled through financial setbacks, buried both of our parents, and celebrated more anniversaries than I could count. Through everything, I believed one thing had never changed. We always found our way back to each other. That kind of trust isn't built overnight. It's built one ordinary day at a time, until you stop imagining life any other way. Our home sat on a quiet street in Ashford, Virginia, where everybody seemed to know everybody else's routine. Across the street lived my neighbor, Tessa Whitmore. She wasn't the type to gossip or stick her nose into other people's business. She simply looked out for the neighborhood. If a package sat on someone's porch too long, she'd bring it inside. If an unfamiliar car circled the block, she'd notice. She was the kind of neighbor you appreciated because she never gave you a reason not to trust her. Then there was my wife's younger brother, Nolan Mercer. If there was one subject Elise and I quietly avoided over the years, it was him. Nolan had spent most of his adult life bouncing from one opportunity to another, always convinced the next job, the next investment, or the next business idea would finally change everything. Somehow, it never did. Every few years he found himself needing another favor, another loan, or another place to stay. Elise always believed he deserved one more chance. I wasn't nearly as optimistic, but after enough conversations that ended with, "He's still my brother, Garrett," I learned when keeping quiet was easier than arguing. The chest pain came out of nowhere. One minute I was replacing a loose fence board in the backyard, and the next I couldn't catch my breath. Elise rushed me to Ashford Regional Medical Center, where doctors moved faster than I could process what was happening. Within hours they were talking about blocked arteries, emergency surgery, and paperwork that suddenly felt much more important than I ever wanted it to be. Watching nurses wheel me toward the operating room, I remember squeezing Elise's hand and telling her I'd be home before she had the chance to miss me. She smiled, but it wasn't the smile I'd known for 3 decades. It looked forced, distracted, almost frightened. Before the operating room doors closed, I noticed Nolan standing beside her in the hallway. He wasn't comforting his sister or asking the doctors questions. Instead, he glanced down at his phone, then leaned toward Elise and quietly said, "Don't worry. I'll take care of everything at the house while he's gone." At the time, those words sounded thoughtful. Looking back now, I wish I had realized they were the beginning of everything that nearly destroyed my life. Garrett had warned himself not to overthink Nolan's words. Hospitals have a way of making ordinary conversations sound heavier than they really are. After 3 days, the doctors finally cleared me to go home. Elise insisted on driving, saying I still needed to take it easy. During the ride, she talked about medications, follow-up appointments, and everything except the house. It wasn't until we pulled into the driveway that I noticed a pickup truck I didn't recognize parked beside my garage. "Nolan's been staying here to help while you were recovering," Elise said before I could ask. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Just for a little while." I nodded without saying much. Part of me appreciated the gesture, but another part couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had followed me ever since waking up in that hospital room. Nolan stepped out onto the front porch carrying a coffee mug like he had lived there for years. He smiled, took my overnight bag from my hand, and said, "Good to have you back, Garrett. Don't worry about a thing. I've been keeping everything under control." Those words should have been comforting. Instead, they landed in my chest like another weight I wasn't ready to carry. The moment I walked inside, something felt different. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic. The furniture was exactly where I remembered it. The family photos still lined the hallway, and the familiar scent of old wood and fresh coffee filled the house. Yet it didn't feel like I was walking into my home. It felt like I was walking into a place where someone had quietly rearranged the rules while I was gone. As I moved toward the kitchen, I noticed little things that shouldn't have mattered. My favorite coffee mug was missing from its usual cabinet. The key bowl near the front door had been moved to a different table. Even my recliner had shifted a few feet closer to the window. They were small changes, the kind most people would ignore. But when you've lived in the same house for over 20 years, you notice when your routine has been disturbed. Nolan didn't stop talking. He explained how he'd handled the lawn, collected the mail, paid a few utility bills, and even reorganized parts of the garage because it made more sense. Every sentence sounded less like someone helping family and more like someone giving a homeowner an update on his own property. Elise barely spoke. Whenever I looked at her, she offered a tired smile before quickly finding something else to focus on. Then my phone vibrated. I glanced down and saw a message from Tessa Whitmore. "Please don't let anyone see this. Go to your bedroom when you're alone and look underneath your bed before you unpack anything." My heart skipped. I looked across the room toward Tessa's house through the front window, but her curtains were closed. I typed back immediately, "What are you talking about?" The message showed as delivered, no reply. A minute later, I tried calling. Straight to voicemail. I stared at my phone, feeling the same cold knot forming in my stomach that I'd felt back in the hospital. Tessa wasn't someone who played games. If she'd sent that message, she had a reason. I forced myself to act normal. "I think I'm going to lie down for a while," I said. Neither Elise nor Nolan questioned it. As I slowly walked toward our bedroom, every step felt heavier than the last. I kept replaying Tessa's words in my mind, "Look underneath your bed." I wasn't even sure what I expected to find. Maybe she'd seen a broken pipe. Maybe Nolan had stored something there. Maybe there was nothing at all. But deep down, I already knew people don't send messages like that unless they're terrified of what someone else might discover. I closed the bedroom door behind me. The house suddenly felt unnaturally quiet. Then I slowly knelt beside the bed, reached into the shadows beneath the frame, and my fingertips touched something that absolutely wasn't supposed to be there. When I pulled the sealed envelope from beneath the mattress, my hands started trembling before I even opened it. Inside were copies of documents that made no sense at first glance. There were property records with highlighted sections, forms carrying my name, and photographs of my home taken while I was lying in that hospital bed. None of them belonged under my mattress, and none of them should have existed in the first place. Before I could study them any longer, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I slipped everything back into the envelope, hid it inside my suitcase, and acted as though I had simply come into the bedroom to rest. Whatever was happening, I wasn't ready to let anyone know I'd found the first piece of it. Over the next 2 days, I stopped thinking like a husband and started thinking like the safety consultant I'd been for nearly 40 years. My career had taught me that accidents rarely happened without warning signs. People ignored the small details because each one seemed harmless on its own. The real danger appeared only after you connected them. So instead of confronting Nolan or questioning Elise, I quietly watched. Every conversation, every routine, and every unexpected change became another piece of a puzzle I didn't yet understand. The hardest part wasn't staying silent. It was pretending everything felt normal when every instinct inside me said it wasn't. The first thing I noticed was the mail. For years, every bill, bank statement, and insurance letter landed in the wooden basket beside the kitchen counter. Now the basket was empty almost every afternoon. One evening I walked past Nolan's room and saw several unopened envelopes stacked neatly on his desk. They all had my name printed across the front. Before I could take a closer look, Nolan casually stepped into the hallway, smiled, and said he'd been sorting paperwork to make things easier while I recovered. It sounded thoughtful, yet something about the way he immediately gathered the envelopes and shut the bedroom door made my stomach tighten. Small changes kept appearing faster than I could explain them away. My online banking password suddenly stopped working. The electric company emailed me to confirm a new contact number I had never submitted. Even the pharmacy called to verify a mailing address that wasn't mine. Every problem could have been dismissed as a simple mistake, but together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Someone wasn't just helping manage my life while I recovered. Someone was quietly trying to take control of it. What disturbed me even more was Elise's behavior. She had always been the first person to notice when something bothered me. Yet now she avoided eye contact whenever Nolan entered the room. If I asked a simple question about the bills or the paperwork, she'd answer quickly before changing the subject. More than once I caught the two of them whispering in the kitchen, only for the conversation to stop the second they realized I was nearby. I wanted to believe she was exhausted from worrying about my surgery, but every day that explanation became harder to accept. Late one afternoon my phone buzzed again. It was another message from Tessa Whitmore, but this one was much shorter than the first. She wrote, "Please be careful. He wasn't just staying there, he was bringing people into your house while you were in the hospital." My pulse immediately quickened. I looked through the front window toward her house and saw her standing on her porch. The moment our eyes met, she gave me a small nod, almost as if she was confirming that every word she had written was true. Before I could step outside, a dark SUV slowly drove past her house. Tessa's expression changed instantly. She turned around, walked back inside, and closed her front door without another glance in my direction. That night I barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, I heard quiet footsteps moving through the hallway. I eased out of bed without waking Elise and cracked the bedroom door just enough to see. Nolan was carrying a folder toward the living room, checking over his shoulder every few seconds as though he didn't want anyone watching him. Instead of following, I waited until he returned upstairs. The next morning the folder had disappeared, but I noticed fresh tire tracks leading away from the driveway. Someone had visited my house in the middle of the night, and whatever they came for, Nolan had made sure it never reached my hands. By then I knew this wasn't about a few misplaced documents or an overbearing house guest. Someone had been making decisions about my home, my finances, and my future, while I was fighting to stay alive in a hospital bed. The envelope hidden inside my suitcase was no longer just suspicious evidence. It was proof that the answers existed somewhere inside my own house. I simply hadn't uncovered the biggest secret yet, and something told me the next discovery would change far more than my opinion of Nolan. For the next few days, I stopped reacting and started collecting. Every suspicious document went into a locked drawer in my workshop instead of back into the bedroom. I photographed every envelope before putting it back where I'd found it, wrote down dates, and even kept a notebook in my truck so I wouldn't forget the smallest detail. Experience had taught me that people willing to tell one lie usually depended on everyone else forgetting the little things. I wasn't going to make that mistake. The more evidence I gathered, the clearer it became that this wasn't a family misunderstanding. It was a carefully planned operation that had started long before I ever walked into that operating room. I knew I couldn't figure it out alone, so I made an appointment with my estate attorney, Vincent Harlan, under the excuse of updating my will after surgery. I didn't mention Nolan over the phone, and I certainly didn't tell Elise where I was going. When Vincent spread the papers across his conference table, his calm expression disappeared almost immediately. He adjusted his glasses, compared signatures one by one, and then looked directly at me. He quietly said, "Garrett, these aren't ordinary documents. Whoever prepared these wasn't organizing your affairs. They were trying to gain legal control over them." My pulse quickened as Vincent explained what I was looking at. Several forms had been partially completed to transfer authority over my financial decisions. Others listed me as medically incapable of managing my own property, even though no doctor had ever made such a declaration. The signatures looked convincing at first glance, but Vincent pointed out tiny differences that only an experienced attorney would notice. My initials were slightly slanted. Dates had been entered in different handwriting, and one witness had supposedly signed a document on a day when hospital records proved I was already under anesthesia. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make everything appear legitimate. The biggest shock came when Vincent opened one folder I hadn't even realized was inside the envelope. It contained a draft deed that would eventually place ownership of my home into a family trust controlled by someone else until I was considered fully recovered. At first, that wording sounded almost reasonable. Then Vincent showed me the name listed as temporary trustee. It wasn't Elise. It wasn't another relative. It was Nolan Mercer. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. I simply stared at the page, trying to convince myself I had misunderstood what I was reading. Driving home, I kept replaying every conversation I'd had with Nolan over the years. Every time he joked that I worked too much. Every casual comment about how expensive my house must be worth now. Every moment he'd acted impressed by the life Elise and I had built together. None of it had seemed important back then. Now every memory carried a different meaning. The realization hurt more than I expected, because betrayal always looks obvious after you finally know where to look. That evening I decided to test something instead of accusing anyone. During dinner, I casually mentioned that I planned to meet with my financial advisor the following week to review all my accounts after the surgery. It was a harmless statement, but the reaction around the table wasn't harmless at all. Nolan nearly dropped his fork before quickly forcing a smile. Elise looked at him for less than a second, yet that single glance said more than words ever could. It wasn't guilt I saw in her eyes. It was fear, real fear. The kind that comes from realizing something is falling apart faster than expected. Later that night, I quietly searched through the filing cabinet in my home office. Most of my original legal paperwork was still there, but several important folders had obviously been disturbed. Documents were no longer arranged in the order I'd kept for years. Some pages had fresh creases, while others were missing entirely. Whoever searched that cabinet hadn't known my filing system well enough to put everything back exactly as they found it. It was another small mistake, but by then I understood something important. Nolan wasn't nearly as careful as he believed he was. The following morning, Vincent called with information that changed everything. He had contacted the county recorder's office to verify whether any paperwork had actually been submitted. Fortunately, nothing had been finalized, but an inquiry had been made only 2 days after I was admitted to the hospital. Someone had already begun asking what documents would be required if the homeowner became permanently incapacitated. Vincent didn't have to tell me whose idea that had been. I already knew. For the first time since leaving the hospital, my anger wasn't directed at Nolan. It was directed at the question I couldn't stop asking myself. How much did Elise really know? Every piece of evidence pointed toward her signature appearing on several forms, yet nothing about her recent behavior felt like someone celebrating a successful plan. Instead, she looked exhausted, anxious, and increasingly trapped. I began wondering if the biggest lie in this entire nightmare wasn't the paperwork at all, but the story Nolan had been telling his own sister from the very beginning. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't whether Nolan Mercer had betrayed me, By then, I had accepted that as fact. What I couldn't answer was whether my own wife had chosen his side, or had simply been too afraid to question him. There was a huge difference between the two, and I refused to destroy a 31-year marriage based on assumptions. If Elise had willingly helped him, I'd face that truth when I had proof. But if she had been manipulated, confronting her too soon would only give Nolan time to erase whatever evidence I hadn't found yet. The following afternoon, I finally walked across the street to see Tessa Whitmore. She opened the door before I even knocked, as though she'd been expecting me. The moment I stepped inside, she locked the door behind me and lowered her voice. She admitted she'd wanted to tell me everything while I was still in the hospital. But every time she saw Nolan outside my house, he seemed to be watching the neighborhood as much as he was watching the property. She didn't know exactly what he was doing, but she knew it wasn't normal. That was why she'd sent the text instead of calling. She was afraid someone would overhear the conversation. Tessa disappeared into another room and returned carrying a small portable hard drive. She placed it on the coffee table without saying a word. When she connected it to her laptop, security footage from the camera above her garage filled the screen. I watched Nolan unlock my front door over and over again during the days I was hospitalized. Sometimes he was alone. Other times unfamiliar people followed him inside, carrying folders, briefcases, or cardboard document boxes. None of them looked like friends stopping by to help. They looked like people conducting business inside a house that didn't belong to them. One particular recording froze me in place. It showed Elise leaving for the hospital early one morning to visit me. Less than 15 minutes later, Nolan returned with a middle-aged man wearing a suit. They stayed inside my house for nearly 2 hours before leaving with several file boxes that had always been stored in my home office. My chest tightened as I watched the timestamp again and again. Whatever those men had been searching for, they had deliberately waited until Elise was gone. That single detail changed everything. If Nolan trusted neither me nor his own sister enough to let them see what he was doing, then he wasn't working with her, he was working around her. Before I left, Tessa handed me something else she'd almost forgotten about. A folded receipt had blown into her yard a few days earlier, after Nolan loaded boxes into his truck. She had picked it up thinking it was trash, but after reading the business name, she decided to keep it. The receipt was from a document shredding company located nearly 40 miles outside Ashford. My stomach sank immediately. People don't drive that far to destroy ordinary paperwork. They do it when they don't want anyone finding what they've destroyed. Suddenly, the missing files from my office made perfect sense. That evening, I drove to meet Vincent Harlan again. After reviewing the security footage and the receipt, he leaned back in his chair and remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he looked at me and said something I wasn't prepared to hear. "Garrett, this has gone beyond attempted fraud. Whoever planned this wasn't hoping you'd sign something by mistake. They were preparing for a future where you either couldn't fight back or weren't expected to come home at all." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something stronger than anger. I felt clarity. Nolan hadn't been reacting to my hospitalization. He'd been waiting for an opportunity like this all along. My surgery hadn't created his plan. It had simply given him the opening he needed to put it into motion. And now that I finally understood the scale of what he was trying to do, I knew there was only one way this story could end. I wasn't going to confront him with accusations. I was going to confront him with proof so overwhelming that, when the moment finally came, he wouldn't have a single lie left to hide behind. By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, I wasn't wondering whether Nolan Mercer had committed a crime anymore. I was wondering how long I could keep pretending I knew nothing. Every instinct told me to storm inside, throw the forged documents onto the kitchen table, and demand answers. But emotions win arguments only in movies. In real life, they give guilty people time to rewrite the truth. So I locked every piece of evidence inside my truck, took a deep breath, and walked through my own front door as though it were just another ordinary evening. Elise was sitting alone in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The moment she saw me, She tried to smile, but it disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Nolan wasn't home, and for the first time in days, the silence between us felt heavier than his presence ever had. I sat across from her without saying a word. After nearly a minute, I quietly asked a question that had been haunting me since I left Vincent's office. Elise, if something happened to me, would you really know who was trying to protect you and who was trying to use you? She froze. Her fingers tightened around the coffee mug, and her eyes immediately filled with tears. She didn't ask why I was saying that. She didn't even pretend to misunderstand the question. Instead, she looked down at the table and whispered that she had been terrified ever since the doctors mentioned emergency surgery. Nolan had stayed beside her through those first frightening hours, constantly telling her that I might never fully recover. According to him, someone needed to make important decisions before strangers or the government became involved. He insisted everything he was doing was only to keep our home and finances safe until I got better. As she spoke, the pieces finally started fitting together. Nolan hadn't manipulated Elise with greed. He had manipulated her with fear. Every document he placed in front of her came wrapped inside another terrifying prediction about my health. Every signature she gave was presented as another way of protecting me, instead of taking something away from me. When I asked whether she had actually read every page before signing, she slowly shook her head. Through tears, she admitted she'd trusted her brother because she believed she was too overwhelmed to understand complicated legal paperwork on her own. Hearing those words hurt, but not for the reason I expected. For the first time, I realized the woman sitting across from me wasn't my enemy. She was another victim. Before either of us could say another word, the sound of Nolan's truck echoed into the driveway. Elise instinctively wiped her eyes and looked toward the window with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't confidence. It was panic. In that moment, I knew she was just as afraid of what would happen next as I was. Nolan walked through the front door a few seconds later, greeting us with the same relaxed smile he'd worn all week. But the second his eyes landed on my face, something changed. His smile hesitated for just a fraction of a second before returning. Most people would never have noticed it. I did. That tiny hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Nolan had seen something in my expression that worried him. Maybe he sensed I had uncovered part of the truth. Maybe he realized Elise had finally started questioning him. Whatever it was, the balance of power inside that house shifted in an instant. He didn't know how much I had discovered, and I intended to keep it that way for just a little longer. Because by then, the final confrontation wasn't a matter of if. It was only a matter of when. The next morning, I called Vincent Harlan before anyone else in the house was awake. By then, we had enough evidence to prove that Nolan Mercer had been planning something far bigger than a temporary stay in my home. But Vincent advised me not to confront him privately. If Nolan realized we had uncovered the forged documents, the security footage, and the timeline connecting everything together, he could destroy whatever evidence remained before law enforcement had a chance to see it. Instead, Vincent suggested something much more effective. We would let Nolan believe his plan had worked right up until the moment it collapsed in front of everyone. Over the next 48 hours, everything was arranged with remarkable precision. Vincent contacted the county recorder's office, my bank's fraud department, and Detective Owen Prescott, who had already reviewed the preliminary evidence. Rather than making an immediate arrest, the detective wanted to observe Nolan's reaction when the forged paperwork was presented. People who spend weeks building elaborate lies often destroy themselves the moment they believe they're about to succeed. We agreed that no one would warn Nolan about the investigation. If he truly believed he was in control, he would expose himself without realizing it. On Friday afternoon, Vincent asked everyone to meet at my house under the pretense of reviewing my estate planning after the surgery. Nolan accepted the invitation without hesitation. In fact, he looked unusually confident when he walked through the front door, carrying a leather folder under his arm. Elise sat quietly beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't slept much since our conversation, but she'd made one decision that changed everything. The night before, she had signed a sworn statement explaining exactly how Nolan had pressured her into signing documents she never fully understood. She wasn't trying to protect her brother anymore. She was finally protecting the truth. The meeting began exactly the way Nolan expected. Vincent casually reviewed routine paperwork while Nolan occasionally interrupted with confident suggestions about keeping things simple during my recovery. He spoke as though he were already part of every important financial decision in my life. Then Vincent calmly placed the forged documents in the center of the table. The room fell silent. Nolan glanced at the papers for only a second before forcing a laugh and insisting he'd never seen them before. It was a convincing performance, until Vincent produced the security footage showing Nolan carrying those exact files into the house while I was still recovering in the hospital. For the first time since this nightmare began, Nolan's confidence cracked. He immediately changed his story, claiming he had only been helping organize paperwork because Elise asked him to. Before he could continue, Elise quietly looked at her brother and said she had never asked him to prepare legal documents, contact government offices, or remove files from my home office. Her voice shook with emotion, but every word was clear. Then Vincent revealed the county records confirming that inquiries about transferring authority over my property had been made just days after my hospitalization. Finally, Detective Owen Prescott stepped forward and placed another folder on the table containing handwriting analysis, bank records, and witness statements gathered during the investigation. The room became painfully quiet. Nolan looked around as though searching for someone who still believed him, but there was no one left. Every explanation he offered was immediately contradicted by another piece of evidence. Every lie uncovered an even bigger one beneath it. After weeks of manipulating people through fear, half-truths, and carefully rehearsed stories, he had finally run out of places to hide. Watching his confidence disappear wasn't satisfying because he looked defeated. It was satisfying because, for the first time since I left that hospital, the truth no longer depended on what anyone believed. It was sitting on the table in black and white, impossible for anyone to deny. The only thing left now was for justice to do what it had been waiting to do all along. Detective Owen Prescott didn't raise his voice or make a dramatic announcement. He simply stood up, walked around the table, and informed Nolan Mercer that he was under arrest for forgery, attempted property fraud, identity theft, and falsifying legal documents. For a brief moment, Nolan looked toward Elise, expecting his sister to defend him the way she always had. Instead, she lowered her eyes and quietly stepped away from him. That single step seemed to hit him harder than the detective's words ever could. He finally understood that the one person he had manipulated for years wasn't standing beside him anymore. As officers escorted Nolan toward the front door, he turned back one last time and insisted he had only been trying to protect the family. No one answered him. There was nothing left to argue about, because the evidence had already spoken louder than any excuse he could invent. A few minutes later, Vincent Harlan handed me official confirmation that every fraudulent document had been frozen and every unauthorized request involving my property had been rejected. Legally, nothing had been taken from me. Emotionally, however, I knew some things could never be returned to the way they once were. After the police left, the house felt strangely quiet. Elise slowly walked over, wrapped both hands around mine, and apologized through tears without trying to justify a single decision she'd made. I didn't offer instant forgiveness because trust doesn't return with one conversation. But I also knew the real enemy had never been fear. It had been the person who used that fear to divide us. For the first time since I woke up in that hospital bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Not victory, not relief. Just the quiet certainty that the truth had finally won, and this home truly belonged to us again. Life didn't magically return to normal after Nolan Mercer was arrested. Some wounds don't heal the moment the truth comes out. Over the following months, Elise and I started rebuilding what fear and deception had nearly destroyed. We attended counseling, had long conversations we'd avoided for years, and slowly learned to trust each other again. Across the street, Tessa Whitmore still waved every morning, and every time I saw her, I was reminded that one honest person willing to speak up had saved far more than my house. She had helped save my family. Looking back now, I realize the biggest thing Nolan tried to steal wasn't my home or my savings. It was my peace. Houses can be protected with locks and bank accounts with passwords, but trust is far more fragile. Once it's broken, earning it back takes courage, patience, and the truth. And in the end, the truth was the only thing that never betrayed me.